The moment John Kendrick walked into the Caldwell livestock auction on that blazing Tuesday morning in the summer of 1883, every man in the yard went quiet, every hand that had been raised dropped like a stone, and every eye in the crowd found somewhere else to look everywhere. That is, except for the steady, clear gaze of Belle Easton, who stood at the far end of the paddock fence with her hand raised and her chin lifted, and not the faintest tremor of hesitation anywhere on her face. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat right on the border of Indian Territory, a rough and living thing of a town that had grown up fast along the Kishom Trail and smelled permanently of cattle dust, wood smoke, and ambition. It was the kind of place where a man's reputation rode ahead of him like a scout, and John Kendrick's reputation had been riding ahead of him for the better part of 5 years. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulder, lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled at the collar of a black coat that was always clean in a town where clean was nearly impossible to maintain. He owned 40,000 acres of rangeland to the south, a herd of close to 3,000 longhorns, water rights that men had gone to court over and lost, and a silence about him that people consistently mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was simply that John Kendrick had learned, through a childhood that had asked more of him than most childhoods ought to, that words spent carelessly were words wasted. He had a habit at every auction he attended. He would walk in, take his position near the center of the yard where everyone could see him, and he would raise his bidding card exactly once, not to open a bid, not to respond to a challenger. He raised it once, turned slowly so the full sweep of the crowd could take in his face, and let the silence do the rest. It worked every single time. Men who had come in with firm intentions to buy a particular lot of horses or a prize bull or a stretch of grazing rights found that their convictions dissolved when John Kendrick looked at them. There was no threat in his expression, no sneer, no intimidation in any form that a man could point to and call out as improper. It was simply that the weight of him, the absolute, settled certainty of him made every other bidder feel, suddenly and acutely, that they were standing in quicksand while he stood on bedrock. Belle Easton had heard all of this. She had heard it from Tom Greer at the feed store, who had described in vivid detail the time John Kendrick had outbid 4 cattlemen from Texas for a prize Hereford bull simply by showing up and breathing. She had heard it from Margaret Holt, the preacher's wife, who said that John Kendrick had a look about him that reminded her of a thunderstorm deciding where to land. She had heard it from her own father, rest his soul, who had lost a bid on 30 prime acres of bottomland to John Kendrick 2 years ago, and had come home shaking his head and saying only, "That man has something the rest of us don't, Belle, and I cannot say with any certainty what it is." Her father had died the following winter of a fever that moved through him in 3 days and left Belle alone on their small farm 6 miles east of town, with a mortgage that had 4 months left before the bank called it due, a kitchen garden, 2 horses, and a very clear understanding of exactly what she needed to do. She needed that bull. The prize Hereford at today's auction was the finest animal she had seen in 3 years of attending every livestock sale within riding distance. Her father had taught her cattle before he taught her anything else, and she knew bloodlines the way some women knew recipe books, by heart, by instinct, by the specific angle of a hip or the depth of a chest. The Hereford at the Caldwell auction was named Caesar, and he was a specimen that could transform her breeding stock within 2 seasons, give her calves worth twice what her current herd was producing, and put her in a position to pay off the mortgage and build something real. Something her father had dreamed of and not quite reached. She had saved for 8 months. She had sold 3 horses she could barely afford to lose. She had taken in mending work through the winter and baked pies for the hotel restaurant through the spring, and she had arrived at the Caldwell auction yard on this dusty Tuesday with $260 folded into the interior pocket of her good dress, and a set of plans that depended entirely on not being frightened away from what she had come to do. She was 26 years old. She had copper-brown hair that she wore pinned up under a straw hat with a faded blue ribbon, eyes the color of Good Creek water, a clear, shifting gray-green, and a face that was honest in the particular way that faces are honest when the person wearing them has decided, at some point and for good reasons, to stop pretending. She was not the kind of woman who drew gasps. She was the kind of woman you noticed slowly and then could not stop noticing, because there was something in her expression that suggested she was always, quietly, thinking something worth hearing. She had been standing at the fence for 20 minutes, watching Caesar move in the paddock when the crowd went quiet around her. She did not turn immediately. She kept her eyes on the bull, finished her mental calculation of what his offspring would bring at market, and only then turned to see what had silenced 400 people simultaneously. John Kendrick was walking through the auction yard gate. He was exactly as described. Large, quiet, dressed in the black coat despite the heat, a gray hat pushed back slightly on his head in a way that was either careless or calculated. She could not immediately tell which. He moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who has never once had to push his way through anything because the way has always opened for him. People did not quite step aside so much as they simply found themselves no longer in his path. He stopped near the center of the yard. He looked around. He raised his bidding card. Belle watched every hand in the yard come down. She watched men who had been gripping their cards firmly 30 seconds ago suddenly find the cards very interesting to study at chest height. She watched a trio of cattlemen from Wichita who had been arguing loudly about the bull's conformation suddenly develop an interest in the fence posts to their left. She did not lower her hand. She was not being defiant exactly. Or rather, she was being defiant but not performatively. It was simply that she could not afford to lower her hand. She had not ridden 6 miles in the July heat, wearing her good dress and carrying every dollar she had managed to scrape together over 8 months in order to be frightened away by a man she did not know. She had a mortgage. She had a farm that her father had broken his back over. She had a bull to buy. So her hand stayed up. She was not even looking at John Kendrick when she made this choice. She was looking at the auctioneer, a red-faced man named Harvey Dodd who had been running auctions in Caldwell for 12 years, and who was at this moment staring at her with an expression she could not entirely read, somewhere between admiration and mild alarm. It was only after a full, stretched-out moment of silence that she felt it. The weight of being looked at. The particular sensation of someone's full, undivided attention settling on you like a hand on a shoulder. She turned her head. John Kendrick was looking directly at her. He was not looking around the yard anymore. He was not performing for the crowd. He was looking at her specifically, with an expression that was not threatening and not dismissive and not condescending in any way she could name, but was instead, she searched for the word and found it, surprised, curious. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he has just seen something he did not expect to see and is not yet sure what to make of it. Belle met his eyes and did not look away, because looking away would have been dishonest, and she had decided a long time ago to be honest. Harvey Dodd cleared his throat with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for precisely this opportunity, and called the auction open. It was the most extraordinary bidding contest Belle had ever participated in, and she had participated in quite a few. She opened at $140, which she knew was aggressive for an opening. John Kendrick countered at $160. She went to $180. He went to $200. She pushed to $220 and felt the edge of her resources beginning to sharpen into something uncomfortably close. He went to $240. She went to $260. The yard was so quiet that she could hear a horse shifting its weight in the far stable. Harvey Dodd looked between them with the expression of a man witnessing something he will be telling people about for years. John Kendrick did not raise his card immediately. This was, in itself, extraordinary. John Kendrick always raised his card immediately. The entire theater of his reputation depended on the speed and certainty with which he responded to any challenge. because speed and certainty communicated that the outcome was already decided, and further resistance was merely a delay. He had learned this at 17, watching older men bluff their way through land negotiations, and he had refined it into something so natural it was no longer a performance, but simply the way he moved through the world. He did not raise his card immediately because he was looking at the woman across the yard and trying to understand what he was seeing. She was not pretending not to be scared. That was the thing. He had seen plenty of people pretend not to be scared of him, and it always had a particular quality, a tightness around the jaw, an overcompensation of the chin, something slightly theatrical in the steadiness. This woman was not pretending to anything. She looked directly back at him, her bidding card held at precisely the same height it had been for the past 4 minutes, her face simply open, present. Whatever this was costing her, she was paying it without drama. He thought about Caesar, the Hereford bull, and thought about the fact that he already had 2 bulls of comparable quality on his south range, and had come to this auction today more out of habit than genuine necessity. He lowered his card. The yard exhaled. Harvey Dodd called it with a hammer strike that rang out across the yard like a small explosion, and Belle Easton let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 minutes and felt her legs, which had been doing an admirable job of pretending to be solid, do something complicated that she chose to interpret as satisfaction rather than relief. She was filling out her paperwork at Harvey Dodd's table when she became aware of someone standing nearby. Not close enough to be intrusive. Just present. She finished writing her name on the transfer document, blotted the ink, and turned around. John Kendrick was standing 6 feet away. His hat was in his hand. This surprised her because she had expected the hat to remain on. Somehow the hat in the hand changed everything about the encounter. "You were the only one who did not lower your hand," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and quieter, and there was something in it that was almost careful, as though he was choosing the words individually. "I had reasons not to," she said. "Most people have reasons," he said. "They lower their hands anyway." She looked at him steadily. "Then I suppose I am not most people." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "I'm John Kendrick." "I know who you are," she said. "I'm Belle Easton." "I know," he said, and this surprised her because she was fairly certain they had never met. He seemed to understand her expression and added, "Harvey Dodd said your name when you submitted your bidding registration this morning." "Ah," she said. Then, because it seemed like the honest thing to say, "I need that bull. I know you probably had reasons too. I'm sorry to have made things difficult." He shook his head once. "You did not make anything difficult," he said. "I had reasons that were less urgent than yours, I suspect." She wanted to ask him how he knew what was urgent about her reasons, but the look on his face suggested he did not entirely know and had simply made the assessment based on something he saw, which was somehow more disarming than if he had been gathering information. "Thank you for—" she started. "You earned it," he said very simply. "Fair bidding." He put his hat back on, nodded at her once, and walked away. She watched him go. The crowd that had been quietly pretending to do other things while angling to observe this conversation suddenly rediscovered genuine business elsewhere, and Belle turned back to her paperwork and pressed her pen to the next line, and only then noticed that her hand was slightly, very slightly, trembling. Not from fear. From something else entirely, which she chose, for now, not to name. She made the arrangements for Caesar to be delivered to her farm the following Friday, settled with Harvey Dodd, and walked back through town to where her horse, a solid roan mare named Clara, was hitched outside the general store. She stopped to buy salt, flour, and a small jar of molasses, loaded her saddlebags, and was untying Clara's reins when she heard her name. She turned. John Kendrick was coming out of the general store, which he must have entered through the side entrance. He was carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and he stopped when he saw her and said nothing for a moment, as though calculating something. "Miss Easton," he said. "Mr. Kendrick," she said. "The farm east of town," he said. "The one that was Samuel Easton's, that would be yours now." It was not quite a question. "It is," she said. He nodded. Your fence line along the North Creek runs onto my grazing rights. Not by much, 20 feet or so. I noticed it last spring. I meant to discuss it with your father, and then he stopped. I'm sorry about your father. The condolence surprised her. It was not performed. It landed with the specific gravity of something genuinely meant. Thank you, she said. The fence line, he said. It is not a problem. I want you to know that. 20 feet of fence is not something I intend to make trouble about. She looked at him. That is kind of you, she said. Then, because honesty had gotten her through the auction and seemed to be a policy worth maintaining, though I should tell you that my father believed that fence line was correct, and I have the original survey to show it. Something happened in John Kendrick's expression that she could not immediately name. After a moment she identified it. He was trying not to smile. I believe that too, he said. I had a surveyor look at it last fall. Your father was right. The fence is in the right place. I only mentioned it because I wanted you to know it would not be a source of conflict. She blinked. Oh, she said. Well, thank you for telling me. Good day, Miss Easton, he said. Good day, Mr. Kendrick, she said. He walked past her toward a black horse hitched further down the street, a fine, solid animal, and mounted with the ease of a man who has been doing that particular thing since he was old enough to stand, which she suspected was around age 4. He rode south without looking back. Belle stood with her hand on Clara's neck and looked after him for longer than she intended. The following 3 weeks were busy in the way that farming is busy in July, which is to say that every moment was accounted for, and most of them were physical. Caesar arrived on a Friday morning, massive and placid and entirely satisfied with himself in the way of great bulls everywhere. And Belle spent the first 2 days simply learning his rhythms, his preferences, the particular note of the sound he made when something pleased him. Her nearest neighbor, a widow named Ruth Caldwell, who had been farming alone for 11 years, and who had the forearms of a blacksmith and the patience of a geologist, came over on the second afternoon to see the new bull and declared him magnificent and told Belle that she had a good eye and her father would be proud. Belle thanked her and then went back to work and did not cry until she was alone in the kitchen that evening, which was when she allowed herself to do it, because she had decided early on that grief was real and should be honored, and simply should not interfere with what needed to be done during the daylight hours. The mortgage payment was due in October. She had 6 weeks after Caesar's arrival to get everything positioned before the banker. A careful and not unkind man named Mr. Aldous Prine would come to assess whether she was making progress. She had spoken to Mr. Prine in March, directly after her father died, and he had looked at her with the specific expression that men wore when they were trying to be gentle about saying something that was not gentle, and had said that the bank would, of course, give her a reasonable period to demonstrate that the farm was viable, and that if she could show a clear plan for repayment by October, the bank would be inclined to be flexible. He had said this while very carefully not saying what would happen if she could not show such a plan. She did not need him to say it. She was not without imagination. It was the first Saturday of August when John Kendrick appeared at her gate. She was in the kitchen garden, kneeling between rows of beans, her hat pushed back on her head and her hands deep in the dirt, when she heard Clara make a sound at the fence, a short, curious noise that meant a horse was nearby. She stood up and turned, and there he was at the gate, sitting his black horse with the patient stillness of a man who is content to wait as long as necessary, holding in his left hand what appeared to be a pie. She walked to the gate and opened it. Mr. Kendrick. Miss Easton. He dismounted and removed his hat, and she noticed, as she had noticed at the auction, that the hat and the hand changed the register of everything. I came to apologize, he said. She looked at the pie. For what? I had my men clearing brush along the north fence line this week, he said. One of my hands, a young fellow who is enthusiastic but not always precise, opened a section of your fence to move the brush through. He replaced it, but the post he used was old and I am not confident it will hold. I brought one of my men this morning to fix it properly. He glanced back toward the road, and she saw, further along, A young man on horseback waiting with what appeared to be fence posts and wire. And Mrs. Holt at the bakery told me you liked peach pie and He stopped. Then with a slightly pained expression that she found deeply endearing, I wanted to acknowledge the inconvenience. She took the pie from him. It was still warm and smelled extraordinary. You did not have to do any of that, she said. I know, he said. My hand made the mistake. It's my responsibility. She looked at the pie, then at him. Would you like coffee, she said, while your man works on the fence? The pause that followed was brief, but she noticed it. Then he said, if it's not an imposition. It was, in the logistics of a busy Saturday on a working farm, a mild imposition, but she had already decided it was worth it. They sat on the porch because the kitchen was warm, and the morning had that particular quality of a Kansas August morning before the real heat arrived, clean and gold and still. She brought coffee and 2 pieces of the peach pie, which was from the Caldwell bakery and was, as Mrs. Holt's pies always were, excellent. John Kendrick sat in the chair that had been her father's and held his coffee cup with both hands and looked out at her yard and her garden and her grazing pasture, where Caesar moved slowly among the other cattle with the dignity of a very important person attending a garden party. He's settling well, John Kendrick said. He's perfect, Belle said, with a sincerity that made John Kendrick glance at her sideways, and she added, I know that sounds excessive, but if you had spent 8 months saving for something and it turned out to be exactly what you hoped, you would use words like perfect too. He was quiet for a moment. Then 8 months. Yes, the auction was you had been planning it that long. Since my father died, she said, I knew what the farm needed. I knew what I needed to do to save it. Caesar was the first piece. John Kendrick turned his coffee cup in his hands. I did not know about your father when I raised my card at the auction, he said. I should tell you that. I know you did not, she said. I did not expect you to know. You were there for your own reasons. I was there out of habit mostly, he said, and the admission cost him something. She could tell, not a great deal, but something. I attend every auction in the county. It is what I do. I had no particular need for that bull. You lowered your card, she said. Yes, he said. Why? She asked, because she had been wondering, and she was not the sort of person who sat on a question when the person who could answer it was sitting on her porch. He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that in another person might feel like evasion, but in him felt like genuine consideration. Because you were the only person in that yard who looked at me like the outcome was still genuinely open, he said at last. Everyone else had already decided what was going to happen. You had not. And I thought, if she has come here with that kind of certainty, she needs this more than I do. Belle held her coffee cup and looked out at the pasture and felt something move through her that was warm and complicated, and she chose, once again, not to name it immediately. That was generous, she said. It was also self-interested, he said. I wanted to know if you would hold. She looked at him. Did you doubt it? No, he said, but I wanted to see it anyway. From down by the north fence came the sound of a post maul striking wood, rhythmic and solid. The morning light spread further across the yard. In the pasture, Caesar raised his large, handsome head and regarded the world with complete satisfaction. After a while, John Kendrick said, Your father was a good man. He bid against me twice over the years, and he was always fair about it. Won once, too, she smiled. The bay mare at the Pratt County auction in '81. That's right, he said, and something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of pleased recognition. You were there. I went to every auction with my father from the time I was 14, she said. He said there was no better education in reading people than watching them bid. He was right, John Kendrick said. They talked for another hour. Not about the farm or the mortgage or the fence line. Those things were present the way water is present in a landscape, shaping everything without being the subject of conversation. They talked about cattle, and the way the Kishom Trail had changed the economics of the whole territory, and what the railroad coming further south would mean for ranchers who had built their lives around the trail drives. They talked about the summer they'd both been children when a drought had come through and stayed for 2 years, and what it had been like to watch the land change its character and then slowly come back. They talked about books, because she mentioned one she had read over the winter, and he had read it too and had thoughts about it that were different from hers, and the disagreement was interesting, and neither of them backed away from it. At the end of the hour, his ranch hand appeared at the corner of the house to report that the fence post was replaced and the wire was sound. John Kendrick stood and put his hat on and thanked her for the coffee, and she walked him to the gate, and they stood there for a moment in the way that people stand when neither of them is quite ready for the conversation to be finished. "Miss Easton," he said. "Mr. Kendrick," she said. "The Sumner County Fair is in 2 weeks," he said. "They have a livestock exhibition. If you wanted to show Caesar, the entry window is still open. It would be good for his reputation in the area." "Which would be good for your breeding prospects." This was true. This was entirely true and practical, and not at all the sort of thing a person said unless they were making a fully rational agricultural observation. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it." He nodded. He mounted his horse. He rode south. She entered Caesar in the Sumner County Fair. She was setting up Caesar's exhibition space at the fair on a warm Friday morning in mid-August, when she heard a familiar voice, and turned to find John Kendrick talking to the exhibition coordinator, a cheerful man named Wilson, who was also trying to manage 3 escaped chickens and a goat that had opinions about the hydrangeas. John Kendrick spotted her across the exhibition floor, nodded once, and excused himself from Wilson's crisis. "Your timing is good," he said when he reached her. "Caesar will go on right after the Angus from the Hartley farm, which means the judges will have been standing in the sun for an hour and will be very grateful for an animal worth looking at." "You have opinions about the fair scheduling," she said. "I have opinions about most things," he said. "I usually keep them to myself." "And yet here you are sharing one with me," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the intention of one. "Here I am," he said. Caesar won second place in the Hereford bull class, which, given that the first place animal was a genuinely extraordinary specimen brought up from Texas by a rancher who seemed to own half the state, was an excellent result. Belle was presented with a blue ribbon that she thought was quite fine, and the judge, an older cattleman named Patterson who had been evaluating livestock for 30 years, told her that Caesar was an outstanding animal and asked her about his breeding program. And she told him, and he listened with the attentive expression of someone who knows they are talking to a person who knows what they are talking about. John Kendrick stood nearby during this exchange, not participating, not hovering, simply present. When Patterson moved on to the next exhibitor and Belle turned around, he was there with 2 glasses of cold lemonade because it was the middle of August and the fair had a lemonade stand, and he handed her one without ceremony. "You know your bloodlines," he said. "I know this particular bloodline," she said. "My father was particular about Herefords." "You knew Patterson too," he said. "Or at least you knew how to talk to him." "I have been at these fairs since I was a child," she said. "You meet the same people. You learn who cares about what." He looked at her with that quality of direct attention she was beginning to recognize, the kind that did not look away and did not try to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. "How old are you?" he asked. 26, she said. Then, because it was a natural question, "And you?" 32, he said. She nodded. They drank their lemonade. Around them, the fair surged with the particular cheerful chaos of agricultural events, children running, animals making their various opinions known, men arguing about feed prices, women comparing preserves. "Miss Easton," he said, after a while, "I wonder if you would like to see the new irrigation system we have installed on the South Range. If it works, and I think it will, it could be adapted for a smaller operation. Something worth knowing about, given the creek access on your property." She looked at him. She was aware that this invitation, framed as an agricultural observation, was also something else, and she suspected he was aware that she was aware of this. "When?" she said. "Sunday morning," he said, "If that suits you." "It suits me," she said. She rode to the Kendrick ranch on Sunday morning, accompanied by Ruth Caldicott, who had offered to come along with the specific energy of a person who is performing a proprietary function, while being entirely transparent about it, because Ruth Caldicott was many things and subtle was not among them. Belle had not asked Ruth to come. Ruth had simply appeared at her gate on Sunday morning and said that she had always wanted to see the Kendrick irrigation works and was coming along. John Kendrick, when they arrived, greeted Ruth Caldicott with a courtesy so genuine and so complete that Ruth, who had been prepared to perform some degree of evaluation of his character, immediately dismounted and shook his hand, and announced that she liked him, which was as high a compliment as Ruth Caldicott had ever given anyone in Belle's presence. The irrigation system was exactly what he had said it was, a gravity-fed network of channels running from the creek, intelligently engineered, using the natural slope of the land to reduce the labor involved in watering the south pastures. The man who had designed it, a quiet engineer named Franklin who had come out from St. Louis, explained the principles with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting to talk about this specific subject, and Belle listened carefully because it was genuinely applicable to her situation. The North Creek that ran along her property could support something similar, smaller in scale but based on the same principles. She asked Franklin questions for 40 minutes. He answered all of them. John Kendrick stood nearby and listened, and occasionally added something precise and useful. And at one point, Belle asked him a question about the water flow during the dry months, and his answer was detailed and confident and based on years of actual observation, not theory. And she thought to herself that whatever else he was a man who paid genuine attention to his land. Afterward, they walked back up to the main house, a large, solid structure of good stone and timber that was neither extravagant nor plain, simply well-built and well-maintained, and John Kendrick's housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Beatrice Yates, who had been running his household since he had purchased the ranch 9 years ago, produced lunch with the efficiency of a military operation. Ruth Caldicott sat across from John Kendrick at the long dining table and interrogated him about his life and family and intentions with the directness of someone who has concluded that circumspection is a waste of everyone's time. He answered everything. He had grown up in Missouri, the eldest of 4 children. His father had died when he was 17, leaving the family in debt, and he had spent the next 8 years working and making calculations and accumulating land and cattle with a patience and ferocity that had eventually produced the 40,000 acres on which they were now sitting. He had never been married. He had no children. He was in good health and had the bones, he said, of someone who had done a great deal of physical labor in his youth, which was a matter-of-fact statement that Ruth received with an appreciative nod. "Why have you never married?" Ruth said, with the tone of someone asking what kind of weather to expect. John Kendrick looked at her. Then he looked at Belle just briefly and then back at Ruth. "I have not met the right person," he said. It was not evasive and it was not a line. It was simply stated. "Well," said Ruth, cutting herself more beef, "at least you know what you don't know." Belle looked at her soup. On the ride back that afternoon, Ruth was silent for an unusually long time, which was the most alarming thing Ruth Caldicott had ever done in Belle's presence. Then she said, "He looks at you the way my Martin used to look at me." Ruth's husband Martin had died 7 years ago, and Ruth spoke of him with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had been genuinely, deeply loved and had loved genuinely and deeply in return, and referred to him as the standard by which she measured things. "Ruth," Belle said. "I'm just saying what I see," Ruth said. Belle looked at the road ahead and said nothing. The following weeks had a quality she had not experienced before, a kind of texture to ordinary days that had not been there before. She was busy, as always. The garden required harvesting and preserving. Caesar's first season with her breeding stock was producing early promising signs. She had sold 2 horses at a respectable profit and was looking at her October mortgage payment with cautious optimism rather than anxiety. But there were other things, too. John Kendrick came by on a Wednesday to drop off a book he thought she might like, a collection of essays about rangeland management that was also, it turned out, genuinely funny in several places, which she had not expected. She left it on his fence post on a Friday, with a note saying she had liked the second essay most and disagreed with the fourth entirely. He appeared on her porch the following Monday morning with coffee and a desire to argue about the fourth essay, which they did for an hour with great enjoyment, neither of them convincing the other but both of them, she suspected, enjoying the disagreement more than they would have enjoyed agreement. He helped her one morning when 2 fence posts on the east side had come down in a night wind, and she was working alone to replace them, appearing simply with tools and without announcement and working beside her without making anything of it. She had learned by then that John Kendrick's expressions of care were almost always functional. He helped people by doing things rather than by saying things, because doing things was the language he trusted most. She was in town on the 3rd Friday of September when she encountered Aldous Prine outside the bank. Mr. Prine was accompanied by a man she did not recognize, a broad, well-dressed man in his 40s, with the specific quality of a person who was not from Kansas and knew it, and had decided this was something to project rather than apologize for. He was introduced as Garfield Moss, a land investor from Chicago, and he shook her hand with the air of someone who believed handshakes were a performance. "Miss Easton," Mr. Prine said, with the careful expression she had come to read as meaning several things simultaneously. "Mr. Moss has been looking at properties in this area. He was asking about your father's farm." Belle looked at Mr. Moss. "My father's farm is mine now," she said, "and it is not for sale." Garfield Moss smiled the smile of a man who had been told things were not for sale many times and had found these statements to be negotiable. "Everything has a price," he said pleasantly. "Some things don't," Belle said just as pleasantly. "Good day, Mr. Moss, Mr. Prine." She walked back to her horse with a steadiness she maintained through pure will, and it was only when she was riding out of town that she processed the look on Aldous Prine's face, which had been apologetic in a way that meant something beyond the specific interaction. Which meant, she understood with a cold clarity, that there had been a conversation she had not been present for, and that the conversation had been about her mortgage and her options, and what might happen if October came and went without sufficient resolution. She went home and sat at her kitchen table with her accounts spread before her and did the mathematics again, as she had done every week since February, looking for room and finding it narrower each time. Caesar's impact on her herd would not produce revenue until next year. The horses she had sold had helped. The pies and the mending had helped. But October was 3 weeks away, and the banknote was larger than what she had. She was still at the table at 9 in the evening when she heard hooves in the yard. She went to the door. John Kendrick was dismounting. He had clearly ridden hard. There was dust on his coat that had not been there earlier, and his horse was blowing. He looked at her through the dark with an expression she had not seen on him before, concerned and not attempting to conceal it. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at him. "How did you know anything was wrong?" she said. "I ran into Ruth Caldwell in town," he said. "She had seen you at the bank and said you had a look on your face that concerned her." He paused. "And me." Belle stood in the doorway and looked at this man who had ridden hard in the dark because a neighbor had said she had a certain expression on her face, and she thought about all the things she could say, that she was fine, that it was nothing, that she had it handled, and discarded all of them because they were not true, and she had committed herself to honesty. "Moss is looking at the farm," she said, "which means the bank told him it might become available, which means Prine is not as flexible as he said." John Kendrick stepped up onto the porch. "Tell me the figure," he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "I can cover that," he said, "right now, tonight." I would ask no interest and no land as security. The offer landed like something bright and heavy, and she looked at him with a clarity that was almost painful. I cannot do that, she said. You can, he said. It is not charity. I am not. He stopped, tried again. Belle. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss. You have built something real here. Your father built something real. I will not stand by and let a Chicago investor absorb it because a bank is impatient. And if I cannot repay you, she said, if next spring's revenue is not what I project, then we discuss it, he said, like two sensible people who have decided to trust each other. She looked at him for a long time. The night was warm and still and smelled of dry grass and distance, and the lamp behind her threw a soft gold light onto the porch boards, and she thought about her father saying that John Kendrick had something the rest of them didn't, and about the look on John Kendrick's face at the auction when she had kept her hand up, and about the way he had lowered his card and she had not been able to explain why. Why, she said. Not what she had been thinking about, just the word. He looked at her, and something happened in his face, something she had not seen before, something careful and honest and entirely undefended. Because I cannot think about another outcome, he said quietly. Because for the past 6 weeks I have found reasons to be on this side of the county that I did not have before, and they are all standing in front of me right now, and I think you know that. The silence that followed was complete. I know that, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The lamp flickered. I would like to call on you, he said, properly, if that is something you want. It is, she said. He came the next afternoon with his hat in his hand, and sat on the porch, and they talked until the sun went down, and the stars came up over the Kansas plain. And this is how it began. Over the following weeks, John Kendrick called on Belle Easton with a regularity that the town of Caldwell absorbed with the particular pleasure communities take in a good story. Ruth Caldecott told everyone she had seen it coming from the first Sunday. Harvey Dodd at the auction house told anyone who would listen that he had known the moment they started bidding against each other. Mrs. Beatrice Yates at the Kendrick Ranch was seen purchasing an additional quality tablecloth, which she would admit meant nothing except that she liked to be prepared. Belle accepted the loan. She kept meticulous records of every cent and what she would repay and when, because she was Belle Easton and she did things with intention and precision. She went to the bank and spoke to Aldous Prine with a calm that made him shift in his chair, and she settled the October note completely, and she watched his expression move from surprise to something that might have been respect. Garfield Moss departed for Chicago on the southbound train on the 3rd of October and was not mentioned again in Caldwell, Kansas. What Belle and John were together was not the kind of thing that announced itself dramatically, at least not at first. It built in the way that real things build, in the particular quality of attention they paid each other, in the way conversations between them went somewhere rather than circling, in the warmth that sat in the air between them that was not performed and not tentative, and not anything other than what it was. He brought her books. She left him notes in the margins of the ones she returned, and he read the notes and argued with them when she next saw him and agreed with them sometimes too. She showed him the way her father had taught her to read a cow's condition from 30 paces, and he showed her the water rights documents he had spent a decade assembling, and the strategy behind them, which was a kind of trust he had not offered anyone before. She cooked dinner for him on a Tuesday in October that was, by both their assessments, the best meal either of them had eaten in years, and they sat at her kitchen table afterward with the remnants of a peach cobbler between them and talked until midnight about the kind of life they each wanted, and discovered, without making a production of it, that the answers were substantially the same. He kissed her for the first time on a November evening when she was returning his books, and he was at the gate, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the late light, turning gold and then amber, and then a deep burning orange over the flat line of the prairie, and she looked up at it and said, I do not think the sky in any other place in the world does what the sky in Kansas does. And he looked at her instead of the sky and said, No, I do not suppose it does. And then he kissed her with a gentleness that surprised her, and then a certainty that did not surprise her at all because certainty, she had learned, was simply what he was. She held the lapel of his coat and kissed him back. "Belle," he said when they separated, and the way he said her name with the quality of a person realizing something they have been aware of for some time without having language for it. "Yes," she said, to everything that word might mean. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold and long, and she spent much of it working the farm and visiting the Kendrick ranch, and being visited in return, and having conversations that went deeper than she had expected any conversation to go. Because John Kendrick, she was learning, was a man who lived most of his life interior, and who, when he trusted someone enough to open that interior, turned out to contain a great deal that was worth knowing. He told her about his father's death on a January evening when they were sitting by her kitchen fire. He told it plainly, the debt his father had left, the younger siblings who needed feeding, the way he had taken every job available at 17 and 18 and 19, and had developed the habit of silence because silence saved energy and energy was currency, and currency was survival. He told her that the reputation he had at auctions was something he had cultivated at first and had then, over time, stopped thinking about because it had simply become part of how he moved through the world, and that he had not, until the day she kept her hand up, considered what it might look like to someone on the other side of it. "And what did it look like?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "You would have to tell me," she thought about it. "It looked like a man who had decided the outcome before the question was asked," she said, "which is efficient if you are trying to move quickly through life, less so if you want the question to be real." He looked at her in the firelight. "That is a fair thing to say," he said. "I did not lower my hand because I could not afford to," she said, "but also because the outcome felt real to me. It was not settled. I did not see why it should be settled until it was actually settled. That is why I lowered mine," he said, "because you were right." She told him about her mother, who had died when Belle was 11, and the years after that when it had been her and her father and the farm and the particular education that came from learning, at 11, that the world could take things from you without warning, and the only honest response was to continue. She told him that she had not been particularly lonely, growing up in that way, but that she had become accustomed to her own company and her own counsel, and that one of the things she found most remarkable about being with him was that his company felt as easy as her own. "That is the greatest compliment anyone has ever paid me," he said. "It is also simply true," she said. He proposed to her in February, on a morning when the snow had frozen overnight, and the whole prairie was glass and light, standing in her kitchen with a ring that had belonged to his mother, and that he held in his hand with the expression of a man who is perfectly certain about the important thing and appropriately nervous about the smaller surrounding things. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have wanted to marry you since about the 3rd Saturday of August, though I think I was aware of the possibility on that Tuesday in July when you were the only person in the auction yard with your hand still up." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about her father who had said he had something the rest of them did not, and she thought that what her father had seen, without having words for it, was that John Kendrick was a person who was completely, fundamentally himself, who had been shaped by hard things, and had used them to become something particular and real rather than letting them make him lesser. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she thought it was warm from being held in his hand, and this seemed important, and he held both her hands in his and looked at her with an openness she had come to understand over the past months was not easy for him and was offered to her completely. They were married in March of 1884, on a Saturday when the first warmth of spring was tentatively making itself known, in the small Caldwell church with Ruth Caldecott crying openly in the front row, and Harvey Dodd grinning in the back, and Mrs. Beatrice Yates wearing the specific expression of a woman whose preparations have all been vindicated. Belle wore a dress of cream wool that she had made herself, because she was extremely good at sewing, and because she wanted it to be something of her own making. John wore his best suit, which was dark blue and which fit him well, and had apparently gotten his hair cut at great personal inconvenience, because it was neat in a way his hair was almost never neat. He looked at her when she came down the aisle with a look that she held in her memory for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simply, completely real. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they did not know they were waiting for and cannot quite believe they found. She looked back at him the same way, because it was the same thing from both directions. After the ceremony, they ate at the hotel restaurant, which had made an enormous amount of food in anticipation, and Ruth Caldecott gave a toast that was both affecting and extremely funny, and went on for 11 minutes while everyone listened with genuine pleasure. Harvey Dodd stood up after Ruth and said only that he had never in 12 years of running auctions seen anything like that Tuesday in July, and was extremely glad for how it had turned out, and sat back down to applause. They moved into the Kendrick ranch after a brief discussion about logistics that was remarkably practical for two people who were also deeply in love, because both of them were primarily practical people who had chosen each other in part because of this quality. The ranch was larger and better resourced. Belle's farm, her father's farm, would be maintained as a working property, managed by a capable young man named Daniel Pratt, who had been looking for steady work, and who turned out to have a genuine talent for cattle. Belle went out to the farm 3 times a week and kept her hand in every decision, because it was hers, and she intended to keep it that way. The Kendrick Ranch, which had been efficiently managed and somewhat sparely lived in for the 9 years since John had built it, underwent a gradual and entirely organic change in character in the months after Belle arrived. It was not that she decorated it, exactly, though she did hang things on walls and buy 2 better chairs for the sitting room. It was more that the house began to hold conversation and cooking smells, and the particular warmth of a place that is being genuinely inhabited by 2 people rather than maintained by one. Mrs. Beatrice Yates, who had been managing the household for years in the quiet and competent way of a person working without an appreciative audience, blossomed visibly in the presence of someone who genuinely engaged with her about menus and provisions and the upcoming task of putting up winter stores. John Kendrick, in the private spaces of his own awareness, had a quality of feeling in the first year of his marriage that he did not have vocabulary for, and did not particularly try to name, because naming it felt like a smaller thing than simply living it. He knew that he came home differently than he had before, that the quarter-mile between the South Range and the house had a different character now, that there was a quality of looking forward to something that he had not previously had associated with the word home. He knew that he was more talkative than he had been, which was still not very talkative by general standards, but was notable enough that his ranch foreman, a weathered and sardonic man named Pete Hawkins, who had worked for him for 6 years, observed that the boss had found his voice and was not complaining about it. In August of 1884, a group of men from the Southern Kansas Cattlemen's Association appeared at the ranch with a proposal. They wanted John Kendrick to serve as the association's representative in a dispute with the railroad over shipping rates, which had been gouging ranchers along the Kishome corridor with a methodical aggression that was cutting into margins that were already thin. It was a public and politically complicated role that he had consistently declined in the past, not from indifference, but from a preference for working through problems personally rather than institutionally. He talked to Belle about it that evening. She listened to the whole thing and then was quiet for a moment and then said, "What would you do if you took it?" He explained what he thought could be achieved. She listened. She asked several questions that were specific and good, and that he did not have immediate answers to, which meant he spent the following 2 days thinking about them. He took the role. Over the following year, he negotiated with the Kansas Pacific Railroad with the same quiet, absolute certainty he brought to auction yards, and achieved a rate reduction that affected 23 ranching operations in the area. Pete Hawkins was heard to remark that anyone who had seen the man bid on a bull could have predicted this outcome, and was correct. Belle, during this same period, expanded the farm's breeding program with 2 additional high-quality cows that she had identified, researched, and purchased with a precision that impressed the sellers and delighted Caesar, who was finding his role in the operation profoundly satisfying. The first calf crop from her new breeding program was, by every measure she applied, exceptional. She paid John back the full amount of the loan in 18 months. She placed the receipts on the kitchen table one evening in November of 1884 and told him what they were, and he looked at them and then at her and shook his head slightly. "You did not need to rush it," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her with an expression that mixed exasperation and admiration in proportions she had come to find extremely endearing. "Belle," he said. "I know," she said, "but it matters to me to have done it properly." "Everything matters to you properly," he said, with a warmth in it that made the observation entirely affectionate. "Yes," she said, "that is correct." He pulled her into a kiss that was neither brief nor perfunctory, and the receipts sat on the table, and the lamp was warm, and outside the Kansas night was doing what it always did, enormous and dark and full of stars that were just present, simply there, without requiring anything from anyone. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a boy they named Samuel John Kendrick, for her father and his, 2 men who had each, in their way, made everything that came after them possible. Samuel arrived with conviction and volume, and a quantity of hair that Mrs. Beatrice Yates declared unprecedented in her experience, which was extensive. John Kendrick held his son for the first time with the specific care of a large, strong man, handling something that is small and irreplaceable, and looked at his face with an expression that Belle watched from the bed and folded into her memory, because it was one of the truest things she had ever seen. Ruth Caldicott arrived the next morning with enough food to provision a small expedition, and the announcement that she intended to be Samuel's unofficial grandmother, which no one contested, and which Ruth then proceeded to execute with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. Samuel was a cheerful and inquisitive child who seemed to have absorbed equal quantities of his mother's directness and his father's intensity, resulting in a toddler who looked at everything very carefully before deciding what to do with it. He was walking confidently by 11 months and talking in full sentences by 18, which John Kendrick treated with the satisfaction of someone whose investment thesis has been confirmed. Belle, in the years after Samuel's birth, did not step back from the farm. She adjusted, reorganized, delegated more to Daniel Pratt, who was proving himself more than capable, and maintained her 3-day-a-week involvement. John hired 2 additional hands for the ranch and improved the bunkhouse, and between the 2 of them they built an operation that by 1887 was one of the more respected in southern Kansas. Not the largest, not the most famous, but solid and thoughtful and getting better with intention rather than accident. There were hard things, too. There was a dry summer in 1886 that required difficult decisions about which cattle to sell early and which to keep, and the decisions were made together at the kitchen table over several evenings, with the accounts spread out and coffee going cold as they talked through the options. There was a conflict with a neighboring ranch over water access that required legal involvement and cost both money and time, and a significant amount of patience, and was eventually resolved in their favor through the same combination of meticulous documentation and absolute steadiness that characterized everything John Kendrick did in the world. There was a week in January of 1887 when Samuel had a fever that was scary enough to require the doctor from Caldwell to come out twice, and those days had a quality of suspended time, of everything else becoming small, that neither of them forgot. The doctor's name was Thomas Aldrich, a relatively young man who had come out from Ohio 3 years earlier and who had the earnestness of someone committed to his work and the competence to back it up. Samuel recovered completely within 10 days, and Dr. Aldrich, on his second visit, stayed for dinner and became a regular presence in their circle of people, which was not large but was made of individuals who were genuinely themselves. That same year, Belle had been thinking seriously about an idea that had been forming for some time. The women in the area, farm wives, ranchers' wives, women running operations alone as she had done, had almost no access to information about livestock management, agricultural technique, or business practices. The men had the Cattlemen's Association. The women had the church sewing circle, which was valuable in its own way, but was not going to help anyone improve their calving rates. She raised this with John one evening, laying it out as she laid everything out clearly, with the reasoning attached, and with a question at the end about whether he thought it was feasible. He did not respond immediately, which she had learned meant he was taking it seriously. After a long moment he said, "It is not only feasible, it is necessary, and I can think of 3 women in this county alone who would be the first to show up." "I think there are more than 3, she said. "I think so too," he said. She organized the first meeting in September of 1887, held at the Caldwell church on a Saturday morning, and invited every woman she knew within 20 miles. 14 women came, which was 14 more than the skeptics in town had predicted when they heard about it, and the conversation that happened in that room for 2 hours was some of the most useful conversation any of them had had in years. They talked about bloodlines and breeding schedules and feed costs and winter preparation and the specific calculations of the beef market and how to read a contract. Belle sat at the head of the table and facilitated with the ease of someone who has been thinking about a problem for long enough that the shape of it is entirely familiar, and John Kendrick, who had offered to help set up and then been firmly instructed to leave, was home when she came back with Samuel on her hip and the specific brightness in her face of someone who has done something real. "How did it go?" he said. 17 women next month, she said. 3 of the ones who came today are bringing friends." He pulled her into an embrace that was warm and unhurried and said against her hair, "Of course they are." The Women's Agricultural Circle, as it came to be called, met monthly and grew steadily and became, within 2 years, something that people came to from as far as the next county. Belle was its clear center not because she was loudest or most assertive, but because she prepared for every meeting the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly, specifically, with genuine attention to what people needed to know and how best to give it to them. In the winter of 1888, John received a letter from his sister Eleanor, the youngest of the 4 Kendrick siblings, who had been enceinte. Louis since their mother died and who had married a man that John had met twice and found adequate if not inspiring. Eleanor's letter said that her husband had died and she was alone with a daughter of 3 and another child coming, and she did not know what she was going to do. John read the letter twice and handed it to Belle, and she read it and handed it back and said, "She should come here." He looked at her. "You do not hesitate," he said. "She is your family," Belle said. "Where else would she go?" Eleanor Kendrick, now Eleanor Marsh, arrived in January of 1889 with her daughter Clara, and a trunk that was worn around the corners, and an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not quite succeeding. Belle met her at the door and took the trunk and told Mrs. Yates to put the kettle on and got Eleanor seated by the fire before anyone had said more than 20 words, and the particular grace of this, the absence of awkwardness, the simple, practical warmth of it, undid Eleanor's composure in about 4 minutes. She cried and apologized for crying, and Belle handed her a handkerchief and said, "Do not apologize. You are exhausted and you have had a hard time and you are home now." Eleanor looked at her brother, who was standing in the doorway with Clara in his arms, and said, "You married a good woman." "I know," John said. Eleanor's second child was born in March, a boy she named Robert, and he was sturdy and healthy, and Belle and John were his godparents. And Clara, at 4, had taken a serious interest in Samuel at 3, which resulted in a friendship that was noisy and productive and required significant supervision. Belle looked at her life in those years and found that it did not look like what she had imagined when she was sitting at her kitchen table in the winter of her father's death, doing the accounts and trying to find room. It looked like something larger and more inhabited and more genuinely hers than anything she had been able to plan for. The farm her father had built was thriving under Daniel Pratt's careful management and her continued oversight. The Kendrick Ranch was a real enterprise, something she was genuinely part of, something whose direction she helped set. The Women's Agricultural Circle was producing real outcomes. 3 of the women who had attended the first meeting had made breeding decisions based on what they had learned there, and had seen their herds improve measurably. Her marriage was, she thought, the thing she had not been able to plan for at all, because she had not known that a person could feel simultaneously so fully themselves and so genuinely connected to another person. John Kendrick was not easy in the ways that easy men were easy. He was still quiet in public, still carried with him the gravity of his reputation, still moved through auction yards and business meetings with the same settled certainty that had cleared rooms for years. But in their kitchen in the evenings, in the particular quality of a Saturday morning when there was nothing urgent and Samuel was playing in the yard and the light was good and they were reading in the same room, he was simply present. Fully, quietly, completely present. She had told Ruth Caldwell once, on one of Ruth's frequent visits, that the thing she had not expected was how funny he was. Not performing funny. Just genuinely, privately amused by things, and specifically by things that she was also amused by, which meant that their private language had a quality of shared absurdity that she found more sustaining than she would have guessed. Ruth had nodded and said, "Martin was like that too. It matters more than people think." They attended every auction in the county in 1889 and 1890, as they had every year of their marriage, because auctions were their industry and their community, and also, though neither of them said this out loud very often, where they had started. John still raised his card with the same quality of settled certainty. People still moved out of his way and lowered their own cards when he raised his. But now Belle stood beside him, and she raised her card too, and there was a moment at the Sumner County Spring Auction of 1889 when John Kendrick and Belle Easton Kendrick were both bidding, against each other, on a pair of quarter horses that they each wanted for different purposes, and the yard watched this with the breathless attention of people witnessing something they have never seen before, and Harvey Dodd, who was running the auction, was smiling so broadly he could barely call the bids. She won. She won because she had done her research on what those specific horses were worth and had come with a precise number, and she hit it and stopped. John, who had been watching her the entire time while also ostensibly watching the horses, let his card down at the exact moment she expected him to, because she had learned to read him as well as she read cattle and the open sky. "You knew I would stop," he said, when they were out of the yard. "I knew what your number was," she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen and recognized now as something specific. It was pride. Not ownership, pride. The kind a person feels when someone they love does something that confirms exactly who they knew that person to be. "Where did I give it away?" he said. "The way your hand moved when they opened at 60, she said. "You adjusted your grip slightly. You do that when a price is hitting the edge of what you had planned." He was quiet for a moment. "You have been studying me," he said. "You have been studying me since the first Tuesday in July of 1883, she said. "It seemed fair." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the full kind, which she had learned was not frequent and was therefore extraordinary, and several people nearby turned to look because John Kendrick laughing fully was not something the county of Sumner had heard very often, and it was, it turned out, a remarkable sound. The spring of 1891 brought a second pregnancy, and Belle navigated it with the same practical attention she brought to everything. adjusting her schedule and delegating more without stopping entirely, because stopping entirely was not something her nature permitted, and she had stopped apologizing for this fact approximately 2 years into her marriage when she had confirmed, with some relief, that John not only accepted this, but considered it one of the things he most admired about her. The child arrived in October, another boy they named William Thomas Kendrick, William for John's grandfather, Thomas for Dr. Aldrich, who had by now become a genuine friend and who was, they both noticed, beginning to look at Eleanor Marsh in a way that was hopeful in several directions. William was smaller than Samuel had been and quieter, but had a quality of attention from his earliest weeks that made Belle think of John, and she told him this one evening when she was nursing William by the bedroom window, and he had come in quietly and sat in the chair nearby, and he looked at her, and the child, with an expression that she understood, was not something he could put into language, and that she did not need him to. John and Belle had a conversation in the early spring of 1892 that mattered in the way that certain conversations matter, not because they changed things, but because they named things that had been true and unnamed. They were riding the South Range in the early morning, which they did when they could, because the light on the Kansas prairie in the early morning was one of those things that the sky did that she had told him once no other sky could do. They rode in easy companionship, the horses steady and calm, and she was thinking about the farm and the improvements she wanted to make to the north pasture irrigation before summer, and he was thinking about something she could not read precisely, which still happened, though less than it once had. He said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I spent 15 years of my life," he said, "building something that I understood to be what I was supposed to build, the land, the herd, the water rights. All of it was deliberate, and I do not regret any of it. But I built it because I knew how to build it, and because it was something that needed doing, and because if I did not do it, it would not be done." He paused, watching the light move on the grass. "I did not think there was something else. I did not know to think about something else." She was quiet, waiting. "And then on a Tuesday in July," he said, "a woman I had never met kept her hand up when I expected her to put it down, and the world has been different since then. And I do not think I have told you clearly enough that this is what I believe." She looked at him in the morning light. She thought about everything, the auction yard and the peach pie and the essays they had argued about, and the fever nights and Eleanor at the door and the auction they had bid against each other, and Samuel and William and all the ordinary extraordinary days that had accumulated into this life, this particular and unmistakable life. "You have told me," she said. "Not always in words, but you have told me." He looked at her. "I want to keep telling you," he said. "For the rest of whatever amount of time we get." "That is exactly what I want too," she said. They rode the rest of the South Range in the morning light, side by side, with the prairie opening ahead of them in every direction. Dr. Thomas Aldrich proposed to Eleanor Marsh in the late fall of 1892, over dinner at the Kendrick Ranch with both John and Belle present, which Belle had known was coming for approximately 3 months, and had said nothing about because she respected Thomas's process, and also because watching Eleanor become someone who laughed easily again was something she preferred not to interfere with. Eleanor said yes with the promptness of someone who has already decided and has simply been waiting for the question, and Clara, who was 7 and had been eating very seriously at the end of the table, announced that she thought this was a good plan and went back to her dinner. Robert, who was 3, said nothing because he had fallen asleep in his chair. The wedding was in the spring of 1893, smaller than Belle and John's and very cheerful, and Thomas turned out to have a brother from Ohio who played the fiddle with great enthusiasm. So the evening went on quite late, and Ruth Caldecott danced with Pete Hawkins, the ranch foreman, in a way that made everyone who saw it very happy. Belle's Women's Agricultural Circle by this point had chapters in 3 counties. It was not an organization she had founded with grand intentions or a vision of institutional scale. It had grown because the need was real, and because the women who came to it were competent and resourceful, and simply needed a place to put that competence to practical use. She was not its only leader now. There were women across the 3 counties who ran their local meetings and brought their own knowledge and experience to the collective. And the thing had become, in the way of genuine institutions, something larger than any one person. She talked about this with John on the evening after the organization's 4th anniversary gathering in September of 1893, sitting on the porch of the ranch house while Samuel, 8 years old, played in the yard with the concentrated energy of a child who has not yet discovered that energy is finite, and William, too, slept inside. "Do you know what I think it is?" she said. "The reason it works." "Tell me," he said. He always said this when she was working something out, which she had come to understand was one of the things she loved most about him, the absolute absence of impatience, the genuine interest in where the thinking went. "It works because everyone who comes to it already knows what they know," she said. "They are not coming to be taught, they are coming to share. And when you start from the assumption that everyone in the room has something worth knowing, the conversation is entirely different." He nodded. "That is what you did at the auction," he said. She looked at him, not understanding immediately. "You assumed," he said, "that the outcome was genuinely open, that your position in it was worth having. That what you needed was real and mattered. You did not come in expecting to be overwhelmed. You came in expecting to be in a real contest." "Yes," she said. "That is what the women at those meetings are doing," he said. "You are giving them an auction where everyone's hand counts." She held this for a moment. Then, "That is a very good way to put it. I have been married to you for 9 years," he said. "Some of your way of thinking has apparently been absorbed." She laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her in the way that was entirely natural by now, the way that 9 years of choosing the same person builds into the body itself. In the yard, Samuel had found a stick and was using it for purposes that were not immediately clear, but were being pursued with great dedication. A horse moved in the far paddock. The evening light, which was the color it always was at this hour in Kansas, deep and golden and somehow both warm and melancholy, the light of things that are beautiful because they pass, spread across the yard and the grass and the horizon. "Belle," John said. "Yes," she said. "I am glad you did not put your hand down," he said. She looked out at the evening light. She thought about her father who had taught her cattle and auctions and honesty and the value of a thing properly built. She thought about 8 months of saving and a Tuesday in July, and a man who had looked at her as though the answer to a question he had not yet asked was standing across an auction yard with her bidding card in the air. "So am I," she said. The years that followed were years of building, not in the dramatic, frontier sense of carving something from nothing, but in the quieter and perhaps more demanding sense of maintaining what is real and adding to it with care. The Kendrick Ranch grew by another 8,000 acres in 1895. Parcels that came available as smaller operations around them were absorbed by the changing economics of the cattle trade, and they managed the growth with the same attention they had always given everything, adding hands carefully, maintaining quality over quantity. Daniel Pratt, who had managed Belle's farm for a decade with increasing competence and genuine dedication, married a woman named Sarah Whitfield in 1894 and settled permanently on the property. Belle gave them the farmhouse with the formality of a proper contract and the warmth of people who have been through hard years together and come out on the other side of it with something worth keeping. She retained her ownership of the land itself and remained deeply involved in its agricultural direction, but the house that her father had built was filled again with a family, which seemed right. Samuel Kendrick, at 13, had his father's horses and his mother's books and his own specific quality of absorption in whatever he was currently interested in, which cycled rapidly between cattle management, mathematics, the mechanics of the windmill pump on the North Range, and an ongoing project involving the creek that he had been explaining to Belle for 6 months in terms that suggested he had thought about it considerably more than he had let on. William, at 5, followed his brother everywhere with the devoted trust of a younger sibling, who has not yet discovered that following your older brother everywhere is something older brothers find wearing, though Samuel, to his credit, had not yet shown signs of wearing. Ruth Caldecott died in the winter of 1896, peacefully, at 73, in her own bed with her house in order and her garden instructions left for the neighbor who would tend it in spring. Belle sat with her the last few days and held her hand and talked to her about Martin and about the farm and about everything that Ruth had been in the landscape of Belle's life. The first Saturday morning visits, the interrogation of John Kendrick at the lunch table, the toast at the wedding, the morning after Samuel was born. She grieved Ruth fully and allowed herself to grieve her, the way she had learned to grieve, with honesty and without evasion, and John sat with her in the evenings and did not try to make it smaller than it was. She was a great woman, Belle said on the evening after the funeral. Yes, he said. She saw things clearly. She saw us, Belle said. She did, he said, before we did. I think we saw it, Belle said. We just did not know the name for it yet. He turned and looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked back at him, and there were 23 years behind them by this point in the story of their lives, starting from that Tuesday in July when the auction yard was quiet, and every hand was down but one, and what was between them had the particular quality of something that has been tested by ordinary time. Not by extraordinary drama, but by the accumulation of years and decisions and small griefs and large ones and laughter and work and disagreement, and the choice, made continuously, to be honest with each other. In 1898, Samuel was 18 and came to his father and mother with a seriousness that was recognizable in both of them, and said that he wanted to study engineering at the university in Lawrence, because he had decided that the future of farming and ranching was in infrastructure, in water systems and soil management, and the mechanics of what made the land productive, and he wanted to understand these things at the level where he could genuinely change them. He had done the research. He had identified the program. He had a plan, which he presented in the systematic and detailed way of a person who has been raised by two people who make plans. Belle looked at his plan. John looked at his plan. They looked at each other. Your grandfather would be very proud of you, Belle told him. Both of them. Samuel left for Lawrence in September of 1898 with a trunk that Belle had packed, and a horse that his father had selected, and a letter of recommendation from Franklin the engineer, who was still at the Kendrick ranch and who had watched Samuel's interest in the windmill pump with the satisfaction of someone who recognizes a successor. William was 11 and showed, in that first autumn without his brother in the house, a quietness that Belle recognized as the particular quietness of someone who is adjusting to a new shape of things. She spent more time with him that fall, riding and reading and talking, and discovered in him something that she had perhaps not had the same chance to notice with Samuel, always in the foreground, a quality of observation and empathy that was striking. He would notice things about people and the animals and the land around him that others missed, and when he said them they were always accurate. You have your father's way of seeing things, she told him one afternoon on a ride. William considered this. Grandmother Ruth said I had your way of talking about what I see, he said. Is that the same thing? It might be both things, she said. I think I want to be a doctor, William said, with the directness of someone who has made the decision and is announcing rather than floating it. Like Thomas, she said. Sort of, he said. But I want to work with animals, the cattle, understanding what makes them sick and how to keep them healthy. Dr. Aldrich says there are programs now. She looked at her younger son, who had her father's name in the middle of his, and who had always been quieter than Samuel, and who had just told her something she had not seen coming and should perhaps have seen coming for years. Then that is what you will do, she said. He looked at her sideways. You are not going to say I should think about it. You clearly have thought about it, she said. Was I supposed to pretend otherwise? He grinned, which was John's grin on his face, and they rode the rest of the way home with the easy companionship that was the specific gift of late childhood. The window before everything became more complicated, when a ride in the afternoon was simply a ride in the afternoon. The last years of the century had a quality of completion, not ending, because nothing was ending, but the sense of a shape becoming visible that had previously only been implied. The Kendrick Ranch was what it was going to be, not static but established, known. Belle's Women's Circle had, by 1900, produced several women who had taken what they had learned and built genuinely successful independent operations, and she had been asked twice to speak at county agricultural conferences, which she did, concisely and practically, to rooms that listened with the attention people give to someone who clearly knows what they are talking about. John Kendrick was 50 years old in 1901, and he wore it the way that men who have worked hard and lived honestly wear their age, with a kind of settled quality, the sense of someone who has become more themselves over time rather than less. There were more lines on his face and his hair had more gray in it, and he moved with a slight deliberateness that had replaced the physical ease of his younger years, but the quality of him, the directness, the silence used precisely, the absolute absence of performance was unchanged. He still attended every auction in the county. He still raised his bidding card with the same settled certainty. People still moved aside. The reputation had endured, though in it now there was also the other things, the railroad negotiation, the fair and consistent dealings of 20 years, the respect of a community that had had plenty of time to assess him, and had found the assessment consistently positive. Belle stood beside him at every auction, and she raised her card when she had reason to, and there was still a quality in the room when they bid against each other that made Harvey Dodd, now in his 60-something year, smile every time. On an afternoon in October of 1901, Belle and John rode out to the north fence line of her father's farm, which she still called her father's farm though it was legally hers and had been for 19 years. The creek ran bright and cold in its channel, and the irrigation system that she had built, adapted from Franklin's design for the Kendrick Ranch, murmured along its course with its usual modest efficiency. The north pasture was full and green for October, which was the whole point. She stood at the fence and looked at it and then at him. "My father would not believe this," she said, "any of this." "He would believe it," John said. "He built the thing that made this possible." "You mean the farm," she said. "I mean you," he said. She looked at him with the full, clear attention that was simply who she was always, still, looking directly at things without pretense. He looked back at her the same way. They had been doing this for 18 years, looking at each other without pretense, and it had not worn down into familiarity so much as deepened into something that was more substantial than what it had been at the beginning, not less warm, not less vivid, but fuller, more supported by the weight of everything they had shared. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was frightened that morning at the auction," she said. "When I heard the yard go quiet, I was frightened." He looked at her steadily. "I did not lower my hand because I could not afford to," she said. "That is true, but I also want you to know that keeping it up was the hardest thing I had done in a long time, and I knew that the moment it was done it would either change everything or it would not, and both outcomes were terrifying, and I did it anyway." "I know," he said. "You could not have known," she said. "You were across the yard." "I could see your face," he said. "I could see it was real. That was the thing I could not look away from, that it was simply real." She thought about the morning in the auction yard, the whole sweep of it, the heat, the crowd, the quiet, the moment his eyes found hers across all that space. She thought about everything that had come from that moment, the specific and enormous life that had built itself from that single decision not to lower her hand. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing it." He took her hand, not dramatically, simply. "The way you take the hand of the person you have spent your life with when there is nothing that needs to be said, and the hand itself says it better." They stood at the fence line with the creek running, and the pasture spread before them, and the Kansas sky doing its enormous, gold-lit October thing. And she held his hand and looked at the farm her father had built, and the life they had made together from the pieces of that stubborn, frightened, clear-eyed morning in July, when the whole auction yard had gone quiet, and she had been the only one who had not lowered her hand. Samuel came home from Lawrence for Christmas of 1901 and brought with him a young woman named Clara, who was a fellow student studying botany and who had her own specific quality of certainty that Belle recognized immediately and loved at once. William, now 14, shook Samuel's girlfriend's hand with the gravity of someone doing something important, and then they all sat around the table in the ranch house and ate the enormous dinner that Mrs. Beatrice Yates, who was 72 and utterly implacable, had been producing since morning, and the noise and warmth of it filled the house from the kitchen to the rafters. John Kendrick sat at the head of the table and looked at his family, his wife beside him and his sons across from him, and Eleanor and Thomas and their children around the end, and the young woman his son had brought home, who clearly had her own version of a hand that would not go down, and he was, as he rarely was publicly and always was privately, simply grateful. For all of it. For the farm that had needed saving, and the auction that had put two people in the same yard on the same Tuesday, and the small, enormous decision not to lower a hand. The winter passed and the spring came, as it always did, inexorable and welcome, greening the Kansas prairie from the ground up, and filling the creek and brightening everything that had survived the cold months by being genuine. Samuel returned to Lawrence and wrote letters that were long and full of enthusiasm and occasional mathematical notation that Belle sometimes had to read twice. William continued his studies and his interest in animal medicine, and showed, in the spring of his 15th year, a talent for the practical care of the cattle that Pete Hawkins, who was getting older and was not given to easy praise, called genuinely exceptional. Belle Easton Kendrick rode her horse across the South Range one April morning in 1902, because she did this when she could, and because the South Range in April was the particular quality of beautiful that made a person feel that the world was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She was 45 years old, and she was healthy and busy, and genuinely happy in the specific way of someone who has looked at her life from the inside and found that it corresponds with what she believed was worth building. She stopped the horse on a slight rise and looked back at the ranch house, solid and warm in the morning light, and beyond it, 6 miles to the northeast, the farm that was her father's and hers, running along its creek, green and growing. John was riding up the slope toward her from the east. She could see him at a distance. She always could. Something in the way he sat a horse was as recognizable as a voice. And when he reached her, he stopped his horse beside hers and looked at what she was looking at and said nothing, because nothing was required. She looked at him. He looked at her. The prairie spread around them in every direction, enormous and alive, under a sky that was doing, as it always did, something that the sky in no other place could quite manage. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They sat their horses in the April light, and the world was solid and real around them. Everything resolved, everything that had been built standing. The life that had begun on a Tuesday in July with a hand that would not come down fully and completely arrived at the place where such things arrive when they are real. Not a dramatic conclusion, not a triumphant final moment, but the ongoing, daily, chosen reality of two people who found each other across a quiet auction yard and decided, and kept deciding, that the other person was worth every dollar and every frightened, honest, steady moment it took to get here. And it was enough. It was, in the way of things that are genuinely enough, more than enough. It was everything.